It's a wooden stick that goes into the rectum. They pull you up and you stay alive like 3 days.
Oh my God, 3 days.
That really terrified his enemy, the Turks.
Yeah.
One, a very bad one, he captured a family, like brothers, and he boiled one of them, and then he forced the rest of the family to eat him.
To his enemies, Vlad the Impaler was more monster than man. He filled battlefields with forests of corpses impaled on stakes, their bodies left to decay in the open air. But death by impalement was only part of his cruelty. Vlad engineered tortures that spread fear faster than his soldiers ever could. Wait until you see why even a mighty Sultan recoiled at his name. What he did is beyond imagination. Burned his own land. Before swords ever clashed, Vlad the Impaler had already struck a decisive blow against his enemies. The spring of 1462 brought with it one of the most unsettling campaigns in medieval Europe. Sultan Mehmed II, already celebrated for his conquest of Constantinople, marched into Wallachia with an army said to number 90,000. It was a force that dwarfed anything Vlad could assemble. Mehmed's goal was simple: to end Vlad's defiance once and for all. But what awaited the Ottoman forces was not an open field of battle. It was something far more disturbing. When the Ottoman soldiers marched across the Danube, they found no fields of waiting soldiers. Instead, they stepped into a land stripped bare and poisoned against them. Fields once rich with crops were torched until nothing but smoke and charred stubble remained. Wells were tainted with disease and animal carcasses, making water deadly to drink. Villages that should have provided shelter were reduced to smoking ruins. Livestock had either been slaughtered outright or driven into the mountains, far out of reach. Everywhere the army turned, they faced silence and desolation. Who would do this to their own people? The answer was Vlad himself. Chroniclers like Leonikos Chalkokondyles recorded how Vlad ordered the destruction of homes and food supplies to deny his enemies a single advantage. It was not mindless cruelty, but calculated resistance. Vlad knew the truth. He could not match Mehmed's forces head-on. If Wallachia became uninhabitable, the Ottoman war machine would grind to a halt before it could crush him. But the strategy went further than fire and ruin. Entire populations were evacuated, sometimes slaughtered, so that no villager could guide or feed the invaders. Diseased men were paid to slip into Ottoman ranks, spreading illness from within. The land itself became a weapon. Its ruler determined that his enemy would find nothing but misery in their march. Vlad made no effort to hide his brutality. In a surviving letter to Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, he described his actions in plain terms. He wrote that he had killed peasants, both men and women, the young as well as the old. He explained that everything in the path of the Ottomans had been burned. This letter, still preserved today in the Hungarian National Archives, gives us a rare window into his own unrepentant view of his campaign. The effect on Mehmed's soldiers was devastating. Unused to the wild forests and mountains of Wallachia, already burdened by hunger and disease, they found themselves surrounded by emptiness. Accounts describe men collapsing from exhaustion, their discipline eroded not by swords but by fear and despair. Some abandoned their posts altogether, unable to endure the harshness of the march. What was this, if not a different kind of war? The Ottomans had come expecting open battle, where numbers and weapons would decide the day. Instead, they faced annihilation without ever seeing a battlefield. Vlad did not need to meet them in a fair fight. He only had to let the land itself devour them piece by piece. And this was only the opening move in his ruthless struggle against one of the most powerful armies in the world. Vlad the Impaler's Forest of the Dead. The march into Wallachia brought the Ottomans face to face with a horror unlike anything they had seen before. Sultan Mehmed II's forces had already endured the desolate landscape Vlad the Impaler had left in his path. But as they advanced deeper toward the Wallachian strongholds, what awaited them was not a burned field or an abandoned village. It was something meant to scar the mind forever. Outside the fortress of Targovishte, they came upon a sight that made even hardened warriors stop in their tracks. Stretching as far as the eye could see was what came to be known as the Forest of the Impaled. Roughly 20,000 bodies, each fixed to tall wooden stakes, stood silent under the sun. They were not anonymous victims, but Ottoman captives, scouts, soldiers, prisoners, and even envoys who had been captured during earlier clashes. Each stake carried a human form in varying states of decay. The Venetian ambassador to Buda, along with Ottoman chroniclers such as Tursun Bey, recorded how this forest of the dead spread across the land like a grotesque warning. It was not enough for Vlad to kill. He wanted his enemies to see what awaited them, to smell it, to feel their courage collapse before the first arrow was fired. French historian Mate Kazaku later described the sight in harrowing detail. Infants had been impaled alongside their mothers, their bodies pierced together. Birds had made nests in the opened entrails of corpses left to rot in the open air. Along the roads leading to Targovishte, and even toward Bucharest, the bodies stretched on and on, some newly impaled and others weathered by time. Travelers and soldiers alike could not escape the horror. How do men march forward when every step brings them closer to such a display? Accounts say that even the hardened warriors in Mehmed's vast army, men accustomed to violence and bloodshed, recoiled at what they saw. Some lost their resolve entirely, while others admitted openly that their morale had been shattered. It was not only the scale of the horror that struck them, but the message behind it. Vlad was not showing mercy. He was not negotiating. He was saying plainly that he would destroy everything, including himself and his people, before he allowed his land to be conquered. Mehmed himself is said to have been shaken when he came face to face with the forest of corpses outside the fortress. The Sultan, who had captured Constantinople, now stood before a landscape that had been transformed into a nightmare. Ottoman accounts record his reaction. After surveying the impaled bodies, Mehmed reportedly remarked to his men that a ruler willing to defend his land through such terrifying means was not one to be easily dispossessed. That judgment carried weight. After witnessing the horrific display, the Sultan turned his forces back toward Constantinople. For all his power, Mehmed recognized that the psychological war Vlad waged was not one he could easily overcome in Wallachia. The campaign had shown something remarkable. Vlad could not hope to match Mehmed in numbers or resources, but through terror, he had managed to halt the advance of one of the most powerful armies in the world. His reputation as the Impaler was not earned by rumor or exaggeration. It was carved into the minds of all who dared to enter his land and lived long enough to carry the memory back home. Dining among the dead. Years before his clash with the Ottoman Sultan, Vlad showed the world what kind of ruler he was. In April of 1459, when he turned his wrath toward the Transylvanian city of Brasov, his forces stormed the settlement, burning houses and looting valuables. In addition, they dragged countless men, women, and children to their deaths. The victims were taken to a hill near the chapel of St. Jacob. where wooden stakes were raised into the sky. One by one, the victims were hoisted upon them, left to writhe in agony until death finally came. The horror of that day was captured decades later in an illustrated account published in Nuremberg in 1499. The description is shocking, not just for the scale of violence, but for what Vlad did next. As hundreds of people suffered around him, he ordered a table to be prepared. In the shadow of the impaled, he sat calmly for a midday meal. Accounts claim that while screams filled the air and blood streamed down the stakes, Vlad dipped bread into it and ate. It was not done in secret, but openly, as though it was part of the spectacle. Why would a ruler behave like this? Was it madness or something more deliberate? To many of his enemies, he appeared insane, but Vlad's cruelty often followed its own cold logic. He was not a lone madman acting without reason. He was a ruler trying to enforce authority through terror. For those living under his rule, crimes were rarely met with mercy. Impalement was the punishment for nearly everything. Whether someone had stolen a loaf of bread or committed a murder, the outcome could be the same. It was his way of ensuring that his people lived in constant fear of stepping out of line. But Vlad's sense of justice could turn even darker. One account describes what happened when a group of traveling gypsies entered his territory. After one of them was caught stealing, Vlad did not settle for impalement. Instead, he ordered the man to be boiled alive. As if that cruelty was not enough, the rest were forced to eat what remained of him. This was how Vlad ruled. Every execution carried a message. Every act of cruelty meant to break both body and spirit. For Vlad, terror was both a weapon and a form of order. Vlad's signature tactic of control. Fear has many faces, but in Wallachia during the 15th century, it often looked like a sharpened stake. Impalement was not something Vlad created. Cultures across Europe and the Middle East had practiced it before. Yet, when Vlad came to power in the mid-15th century, he turned this method into something more than punishment. For him, it became a statement. It was discipline for his own subjects, a warning to outsiders, and a way to carve his authority into the very land he ruled. But what exactly did he do? Chroniclers from Saxon towns, the Ottoman Empire, and Slavic regions all recorded the same thing. Vlad used impalement on a scale that no one had ever seen. His soldiers prepared sharpened stakes, and the victims were forced onto them while still alive. Sometimes the wood was smoothed so that it pierced the body slowly, avoiding vital organs. Death could take hours, even days. Imagine what it meant for villagers or invading soldiers to walk past hundreds of victims, all arranged in rows or circles, placed at different heights, their suffering stretched out for public view. Was it cruelty, or was it calculated strategy? He did not reserve this punishment only for war. Theft, corruption, and disobedience could all end with the stake. One writer claimed that even a woman who lied about her husband's work was sentenced in this way because Vlad believed dishonesty threatened the order of his society. In his mind, every false word, every betrayal could unravel control, and control was everything. For his enemies, this was terror beyond the battlefield. For Vlad himself, it was law, power, and dominance made visible. To this day, the name the Impaler carries the memory of a ruler who turned death into the foundation of his rule. Vlad's captives of terror. History remembers the stakes, but there was something else Vlad used to spread fear. The summer of 1462 marked one of the darkest moments in the war between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire. By then, Vlad had already scorched his own lands and left entire valleys filled with wooden stakes. But what he did next was far more personal. It was not just about destroying armies. It was about cutting into the spirit of his enemies. Captured soldiers were not executed outright. Instead, they were carefully chosen and released back to the Ottomans. But they returned carrying more than wounds. They returned as walking signs of terror. According to Slavic accounts like The Tale of Prince Dracula, Vlad mutilated prisoners before letting them go. Some had their eyes destroyed. Others lost their ears or noses. Many were marked with scars so deep that their bodies would never heal the same way again. Imagine facing an enemy who doesn't kill all his captives, but instead sends them back to you as human warnings. What kind of effect would that have on an army preparing for battle? But Vlad did not stop at mutilation. Some chronicles describe how he branded the skin of captives with hot irons. Others mention that he carved shapes into their flesh, turning bodies into symbols of ridicule. A few historians even argue that these markings were aimed at mocking the religious identity of Muslim prisoners. While not every source confirms this fully, what is clear is that these punishments were never random. They were chosen to cause humiliation as well as pain. Why let them live at all? For Vlad, execution could end a man's suffering, but releasing the broken survivor gave his message a longer reach. The captives walked back into Ottoman lines carrying proof of his cruelty on their own bodies. They were living messages, more effective than any letter sealed with wax. For Sultan Mehmed II, this act went beyond cruelty. It was an open insult. To return soldiers in pieces was to declare that he had no fear of Ottoman retaliation. It was Vlad's way of showing that he was not intimidated by the empire, already humbled much of the Christian world. This was psychological warfare sharpened to its cruelest point. It left soldiers questioning what fate might await them if captured, and it forced leaders to confront the reality that Vlad was willing to cross every boundary of warfare in order to hold his ground. The impact stretched beyond the battlefield of 1462. Word of mutilated captives spread quickly through the Balkans. Farmers, villagers, and nobles all heard of the man who scarred bodies into messages. Even those who had never seen him began to fear him, and that fear made hesitation grow inside Mehmed's forces. Vlad had turned pain into a weapon, terror into policy. His fields of stakes may have caught the eye, but his walking messengers of horror dug into the mind. That is what made him more than just a ruler defending his land. It made him a master of fear itself. The feast that ended in death. What makes a ruler turn into a figure feared for centuries? Vlad's early life holds the answer. In 1442, he traveled with his father, Vlad II, and his younger brother, Radu, on what was meant to be a diplomatic mission into the Ottoman Empire. What started as politics quickly turned into captivity. The Ottomans seized the family, offering Vlad II his freedom on one condition: that his two sons would remain behind as hostages. Faced with the choice of protecting his throne or protecting his children, Vlad II chose to leave the boys in enemy hands. The brothers were taken to a citadel high above the town of Erigöz, now called Dorugöz in modern Turkey. There, surrounded by stone walls and cut off from their homeland, they remained for 5 years. Not everything about their captivity was brutal. The Ottomans instructed them in philosophy, science, and the strategies of war. Yet accounts also describe darker treatment. Vlad, unlike his younger brother, is believed to have been beaten and humiliated. These were experiences that would leave deep scars. Many historians argue that it was in those years that his hatred for the Ottomans began to take root. When he finally returned home, Vlad faced another nightmare. His father had been betrayed by his own nobles, the boyars. Vlad II was killed in the marshes near his home, while Vlad's elder brother Mircea met an even more horrifying end. He was tortured, blinded, and buried alive. Imagine being a young man carrying the weight of captivity and then stepping back into a world where your family had been slaughtered in the most brutal ways. What would that do to a person? For Vlad, it marked the turning point that drove him down the violent path history remembers. Freed after his family's fall, Vlad stepped into a world where violence seemed to be the only language of power, and he had learned to speak it well. He knew that the boyars who had once pledged loyalty to his father had played a role in the treachery. However, he did not know exactly which ones had conspired, so he made a choice that would cement his reputation. He invited them all. Nearly 500 nobles were summoned to a great feast. At first, the event seemed like a show of goodwill. Plates of food were served, and the hall filled with laughter and talk. But once the meal was over, soldiers stormed the room. One by one, every nobleman was seized. There would be no trials, no questions, no second chances. Each was dragged out and impaled on tall wooden stakes, with their bodies left to rot in the open. What kind of man turns a banquet into an execution ground? Was it revenge? Justice? Or simply the first act of a ruler who had learned that fear could be stronger than loyalty? Whatever the answer, Vlad had taken his first decisive step toward becoming the figure history would never forget. He nailed turbans to ambassadors' heads. The way Vlad III handled his enemies was not only violent, but carefully thought out. Every act carried a message, and every punishment had a purpose. His father had dealt with the Ottomans cautiously, but Vlad took a different path. Unlike many rulers who balanced war and diplomacy, he never stopped resisting the Turks. In this, he found an ally in Matthias Corvinus, the Hungarian king and son of János Hunyadi, who shared his opposition to Ottoman expansion. But what made Vlad different was how he expressed defiance. His methods on the battlefield and in the throne room shocked both his enemies and his allies. In 1459, before the war escalated, Sultan Mehmed II decided to test Vlad's loyalty. He sent 2 ambassadors to Wallachia with a demand. They carried a message. The Sultan expected 10,000 ducats and 300 young boys as tribute. For the Ottomans, this was standard practice, but for Vlad, it was an open insult. When the ambassadors entered his throne room, he demanded that they remove their turbans. For Wallachian custom, it was disrespectful to speak to the prince with one's head covered. But for the Turks, the turban was more than clothing. It was a symbol of faith. Removing it was not only dishonorable, but sacrilegious. The envoys stood firm, refusing to take them off. To them, disobedience in this case was safer than betraying their faith. What they did not realize was that they had underestimated the brutality of the man they were speaking to. Vlad gave an order. Guards rushed in and seized the ambassadors. He then declared that if they valued their turbans so highly, they should keep them forever. Large nails were hammered straight through the fabric into their skulls. The sound of iron striking bone filled the hall as the men cried out in agony. Vlad did not look away. He sat and watched, his expression cold, as their bodies twisted and their voices broke under the pain. For him, this was more than punishment. It was a lesson. No one, not even the representatives of the Sultan, would leave his presence without remembering his power. But this was only the beginning. 2 years later, in 1461, another encounter tested his resolve. The Turks extended an offer to meet for peace talks. On the surface, it seemed like a chance to avoid war. In truth, it was a trap. Mehmed's forces intended to ambush Vlad during the meeting and crush him with surprise. Instead of walking into the snare, Vlad turned the plan against them. He launched an attack across the Danube into Ottoman territory. His strike was not only swift, but devastating. Entire settlements were put to the torch, and soldiers were cut down without mercy. As for the captives, they faced punishments designed to terrorize anyone who might oppose him again. What made his approach so disturbing was not just the death toll. It was the way he used cruelty as a tool. Every nail driven into a skull, every burning village, every stake rising out of the ground was meant to communicate one idea. Resistance to Vlad Dracula would come at a cost too horrifying to bear. So the question remains, how far was Vlad willing to go to make sure the world feared him? Terror as a weapon. Some rulers were remembered for building empires, others for defending their lands. Vlad of Wallachia, however, earned his place in history for the way he dealt with those he considered unworthy of mercy. His punishments were so brutal, so calculated, that they continue to shock even centuries later. In the bustling capital of Tirgoviste, people went about their lives as best as they could under his rule. But beneath the city's routine, Vlad carried with him a vision that was darker than most could imagine. He wanted a cleaner and stronger state, and he was willing to go to horrifying lengths to achieve it. The poor, the sick, and the homeless were seen as a burden. Vlad believed they had no place in his Wallachia, so he came up with an idea that still makes historians pause. He announced a generous feast where he invited the sick, beggars, wanderers, and those with no means of supporting themselves. The promise of food and warmth lured them in. At the gathering, plates were full and cups were poured. For a brief moment, those who had nothing felt as though they had finally been welcomed. But when the meal was finished, Vlad excused himself. The doors were shut tight. Guards boarded the hall from the outside, and then fire was set to the building. Those inside screamed and fought to escape, but the flames consumed everything. Not one person survived. He carried out such acts more than once. Some sources even claim he burned entire villages without clear reason, reducing them to ash and leaving nothing but silence where people once lived. Yet burning was only one of the methods he used. Other accounts describe executions that sound closer to nightmares than history. Vlad had a massive copper cauldron built, covered with a wooden lid pierced with holes. Victims were forced inside, their heads pushed through those openings so that they could not escape. Once trapped, water was poured in and a fire lit beneath. As steam rose and the heat grew unbearable, their screams filled the air until their bodies gave out. It was not a quick death. Even more chilling were the punishments reserved for women and children. He ordered women to be impaled together with their infants, the wooden stake piercing through them both. Witnesses said the babies fought to survive, struggling at their mothers' breasts until life left them. If that was not horrifying enough, he then ordered that the women's breasts be cut open and the infants placed inside before both were impaled again as one. The question arises, why invent punishments of such cruelty? Was it meant as a warning to enemies? Was it meant to terrify his people into obedience? Perhaps both. For Vlad, torture was not random. It was theater designed to send a message. Every execution, every act of brutality, was staged for maximum fear, and it worked. His enemies dreaded him, his allies tolerated him, and his subjects obeyed him because the alternative was too gruesome to consider. Vlad the Impaler did not just fight wars on battlefields. He waged war on human lives, reshaping power in his land with fire, iron, and unimaginable pain. What survives of his reign is not the image of a noble prince, but of a ruler who made cruelty itself into a weapon. The brutal death of Vlad the Impaler. The battlefield was where Vlad's life finally ended, but the way it happened only deepened the legend around him. Surrounded by the advancing Turkish army, he fought to the very end. Yet no amount of brutality could save him from the one thing he could not control: numbers. The Turks outnumbered him heavily, and many of his own men decided they had had enough. They deserted, some even joining the enemy. Why stay loyal to a ruler known for punishing his own soldiers as harshly as he did his enemies? In the chaos of defeat, Vlad was killed. Some accounts claim that it was Turkish soldiers who struck him down. Others suggest something far more humiliating, that his own men turned against him and delivered the final blow. What we do know is that after his death, his head was cut off and presented as a trophy to the Ottoman Sultan. The Sultan had it placed on a spear and displayed outside his palace gates. For a man who had terrified thousands with the sight of impaled bodies, ending up as one himself carried a cruel irony. But what about his body? That part of the story is where things become a bit unclear. Some sources say he was buried at Snagov Monastery near Bucharest. This is a place not far from his seat of power. However, when researchers examined the supposed burial site, they found nothing. Other reports claim that his remains were discovered at one point, only to vanish again. Was it theft? That would not be unusual. As a ruler of high status, he would likely have been buried with treasure, a temptation for any grave robber. Then comes a more unsettling possibility. What if his body was never buried there at all? The records from the time are inconsistent, and no physical proof exists today. For centuries, people have speculated whether his grave was looted or if his burial was deliberately hidden to prevent desecration. Without a clear answer, his final resting place remains as mysterious as the man himself. This uncertainty only adds to Vlad's reputation. He was a ruler who rose to power through fear, who used brutality as a weapon and as a message. He burned beggars alive, boiled enemies in cauldrons, and impaled entire villages. His punishments were designed not only to kill, but to shock, to paralyze his rivals into obedience. And in the end, even in death, he left behind questions that no historian has been able to fully solve. Think about this. The man who made sure his enemies had no unmarked graves may have ended up with none himself. Is there not a dark sense of justice in that? Centuries later, his name still inspires fascination. To some, he is remembered as a national hero who fought against the Ottomans. To others, he is a figure of horror whose cruelty went beyond imagination. And perhaps this is why his story refuses to fade. His legacy lies not only in the history books, but in every rumor, mystery, and every unsettling tale that still surrounds him. If you made it this far, then you clearly have the courage to face the darker corners of history. So why not go further with us? This video, subscribe to the channel, and be ready for the next time we explore another piece of the past that most people shy away from.